Ladies and gentlemen, Minecraft 1.13 has been out for a while now, and it's time to dig into the new command things in this version. I left it out of my general update video for 1.13, not only because that video was long enough already, that clocked in at almost 35 minutes, but this version contains what is definitely the biggest change to the command system in Minecraft history. And that is not all in terms of map making. There's also a whole bunch of new resource and data pack things in this, new custom crafting, advancement changes, loot tables, and all kinds of fancy things with structures. So there will be yet another video after this to come. We're gonna brush only lightly onto those subjects in this one. Now, to set the expectations straight on what this video is, it's not going to be a full tutorial of how to use these things. I am assuming in this video that you know commands from the previous version. This is going to tell you what's different. I do hope to have tutorials out for how to use commands in general in Minecraft 1.13, but that will take longer. So, what is the big deal in this version when it comes to commands? Well, there's a new command parsing library. It actually is a separate library and it's known as Brigadier. That is the name of the new command parsing system. And what is the point of this? Well, it is faster because it compiles commands up front, and that also means you get errors produced way earlier in the process and much better feedback. As I was the person who rewrote the command parsing system for the Bedrock version of the game, I also had the opportunity to work closely together with Dinnerbone and have some pretty deep discussions about some of this functionality, so I know a lot of the background for it. So before we get into some of the specifics, let's go through some of the more generic things that have changed. Most commands have turned case sensitive or more case sensitive than before. And at the same time they've turned less white space sensitive, so you can now put white space inside of command selector arguments, for instance, which helps a lot with readability and with navigating with the keyboard. Now there are more changes to context specifically, and where and how commands get run differs a lot. So commands executed by the server itself, that is anything you input on the server console or anything that runs as a function without being triggered by a player, that used to run at the origin of the overworld, that is 000 in the overworld, and now instead it will run at world spawn in the overworld. Command output has been changed a bunch as well. Commands used to have a whole range of different output fields, like affected blocks, affected items, and you could use the incredibly complicated stats command to track these and get values into scoreboards from them. When Dinnerbone and I discussed this, we came to the conclusion that there really is only two different fields. One is the success count of the command, that is how many times did it succeed at doing something, and the other thing is the result, that is how many items did you have, or how many blocks matched something, or something like that. One thing to note here is that result is always 0 if the command fails, so if success is 0 then result will also be 0. And command blocks, if you're still using those, especially if you're using them with comparators, then the output will now be the result rather than the success count. Together with this new command parser, there's also a new user interface where there's new fancy syntax suggestions with color and new error displays, so you can see errors in the command as you're writing it without having to run it. There's also autocomplete for a whole bunch of new things like selector argument and for custom sound events and things like that. Functions have also changed, like I mentioned before. The new parser will compile the commands up front. That means that functions are now parsed on load, and you'll get all of the error messages up front. You don't have to wait for the function to run before you get any error messages. Functions have also been moved. They used to be in a data folder. Now there are data packs. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, I'm not going to go through all of the details, but basically a data pack is a zip or folder inside of the data packs folder in your world folder, where you have a collection of functionality for the server, just like a resource pack is a collection of functionality for the client. Notably, there are loot tables, advancements, crafting recipes, and functions in here. And basically what you need is you need a .mc meta file, just like you need for a resource pack, and then you have a data folder, a namespace folder under that, and a functions folder under that one. Another new thing in data packs are tags. We're not going to go through them in detail either, but they are groupings of things. And there are function tags. You can have a function tag with a bunch of functions in them, and then run /function and hashtag, then namespace and colon the tag, to run all the functions in that tag instead of just one function individually. And this tagging functionality is actually used by the core game as well. The game loop function game rule has been removed, and in its place you now have a Minecraft:tick function tag. And if you add functions to that tag inside of your data pack, then they will also run every tick. That means that you are no longer in need to fight over this one game loop function game rule, you can switch them over. One change to this though is that ticking functions now run before the world, not after the world, in simulation order. That means that if you both have a function that was previously a game loop function and command blocks, then the commands in your command blocks will now run after your commands in the function rather than before. There's another new tag for functions as well that's called Minecraft:load, and if you add a function to that tag, that function will run every time the data pack is loaded, and that includes being reloaded. And the slash function no longer has an if or unless argument, because that is now available in the /execute function. Alright, but let's start getting into the actual syntax changes, because like I said at the beginning of the video, this is one of the biggest changes to commands that has happened in the history of Minecraft. And let's start with the coordinates. Local coordinates have been ported in from Bedrock Edition, where I implemented it. Local coordinates are specified using the caret sign, very similar to how relative coordinates are, except that you have to use it on all three. And what it does is it changes the space that your translation happens in, so that it happens relative to the rotation of the entity running the command. Now that's not strictly true, we'll get into changes to contexts and executes later, but basically what it means is you specify something in terms of left, up and forward directions rather than global X, Y and Z directions. To be specific, the rotation of left, up and forwards is relative to the current context rotation, which defaults to 0, 0 if you just have a command run from a command block or from the server console, for instance, and that's 0, 0, which is straight south, looking straight flat south. Anyway, local coordinates functionality is sometimes called raycasting, not strictly correct, but it can be used to implement raycasting, but together with some of the other new features it makes a whole range of new functionality easily available. Another major change is inside of Selector. Selector argument specification have changed. Numeric matching, anything that used to be a number, usually had one limit and then one other limit called something else. So for instance, if you matched levels, there was an L and an LM for minimum and maximum level ranges. The new system has range matching. That means that if you type an argument equals a number, then you mean exactly that number. And then you can use two dots to specify a range between two numbers. An open-ended range like ... and then a number means that you're matching any number less than or equal to that number. If you're using number ... that means any number greater than or that number. And then of course you can specify both limits to match anything that is one of those two numbers or anything in between. Of course, the minimum should be lower than the maximum. Together with this, all the arguments have been renamed. What used to be called C is now called limit, and sets the number of allowed result from the query. M is now called game mode, and that has been changed so it no longer supports any numeric modes or shorthand modes. So you can't put equals C anymore, you have to put equals creative. The L and LM functionality has been changed into level, and it takes a range. The R and RM arguments have been changed into distance, also takes a range. The RX and RXM arguments have been changed into X_rotation and takes a range. And RY and RYM have been changed into Y_rotation and it also takes a range. There are more changes to these. There are now decimal number support in all of the places where you have coordinates or rotations or distances, so you can specify exact amounts even if they are not full integers. You can also quote arguments, so if you're trying to match something on name, your matched name can include spaces or other quote-unquote invalid characters as long as you quote that name. And of course, as I mentioned, you can now have spaces in the selector arguments to not have it all be one big soup of characters. You used to be able to put in a negative C value for the count to invert the sorting of entities. That has been split up. You can no longer put negative values for limit, and instead there is a new argument. It's called sort, and you give it one of 4 values. It's nearest, furthest, random, and arbitrary. Now what these means is nearest is the usual sorting that you got before. Furthest is what you got before if you put a negative value, where you get the resulting entity that's the furthest away first. And then there's random, which gives you a random order, just like @r did before, and arbitrary, which is a new value that gives you the result in whatever order the game desires. So you better not use this for anything where the order matters. And the reason to use this is that it's better for performance. It's much quicker for the game to just pick out the entities in whatever order they are stored internally, rather than first having to find them all and compare them on distance or randomly sort them. Together with this, some of the actual selectors have changed, and @r is now valid only for players, since you can specify sort equals random for @e as well. And the default sorting for @a and @e has changed to arbitrary, because most of the time when you're using one of those, you're basically just wanting to process something for all of the entities. Another change is that you can now supply multiple of the same selector arguments where it makes sense. So for instance, you can put tag equals one tag and then tag equals another tag. And you can also put a number of inverse type arguments into the same selection. Score matching has changed. You used to have score underscore and a bunch of names. And now instead you have scores equal and then a block of different score checks, and each one of those is individually a range. You can now also match advancements inside of selectors. You do that with advancements equal and then another block where you put advancement IDs equal true or false, where true means the player has to have the advancement and false means the player should not have the advancement. And then you can also check for sub-advancement criteria by putting in an advancement name equals and then a block, and within that a criteria name equals true or false. And finally, one more thing is that you can match NBT blocks inside of any selector now, and you can just put NBT equals and then a block of NBT data matching, and you will only get to select the entities that match that data. Block specifiers have changed in this version as well. As you might have heard, there has been a world flattening, and that means that there are no longer any numeric IDs for blocks, and also there are no data values for blocks anymore. So anything that used to specify a data value or a block numeric ID as an option no longer does. Instead, block specifiers have been changed so they can always include block states and NBT. So whenever a block is changed or matched, you can use a syntax where you put an ID first and then in square brackets a number of block states, and then in curly braces some NBT specifiers. And here the block ID is required, but either the block states or the NBT or both can be omitted. So when matching blocks, only the provided block states will be checked, and when setting blocks, any state that is not provided will be set to whatever default value is appropriate. As I mentioned before, there are also tags in this version of the game, and instead of using a single block ID, you can use a hash sign and then a namespace colon and a block tag instead, and this will match any of the blocks inside of that tag. Of course, if the namespace is Minecraft, you don't actually have to specify it. Item specifiers have changed as well, and for the same reasons there are no longer any numeric IDs. That means that there are also no data values or damage values on items. Whenever an item has an actual damage property, that is now a property inside of NBT. Item specifiers can always include NBT now, and that goes whenever an item is both matched or set. Syntax for this is very similar to blocks. You put in the item ID first and then in curly braces whatever NBT stuff you want to match or set. The ID is required, the NBT can be omitted, and also you can use an item tag to match instead of an item ID, and in the same way you use a hash sign and then the namespace and the colon and the item tag. Now to get into one of the biggest changes in this version, and that is about the execution context of a command and the /execute function. And to understand where this came from, sort of the background behind this is that the old execute, the old /execute command did several things at once. One of those things was to change the executing entity and in the process maybe multiplying the execution, and the other thing is to reset the position that the command executed in to one that was based off of that entity. Now that was sometimes very beneficial, but it was very rare that you actually wanted both of these functionalities in one command. Usually you would have tilde, for the position because you only cared about the executing entity, or you would have something like @s because you only wanted to change your position. Now the new syntax splits all of this functionality apart, and it uses the /execute command as a basis for a lot of the functionality of this new system. The new syntax is basically /execute and then a chain of specifiers followed by run and your subcommand. That means that you do /execute and then a bunch of different things to change how the command gets run, and even if the command gets run, and what happens to the result of the command, and then you specify whatever the command is that you want to run. Now the context is always the base of all operations, so that includes what entity, if any, is running the command, what dimension the command runs in, what position it runs in, and the rotation it runs in. Now for a direct upgrade, it is possible to write any old execute command as a new execute command, and the direct translation is execute as whatever selector you had, @s, positioned, and then your X, Y, and Z specifiers, followed by run and whatever the subcommand was before. Now, most parts of this command are probably not necessary for most old execute commands. So this new execute command is incredibly powerful, and it does a lot of things that people have been asking for a very, very long time in Minecraft, and I'm really happy that I managed to kindly convince Dinnerbone to put some of this stuff in. You might have seen a really old video on this channel where I initially suggested some of the syntax that has grown into what is now in this system. To understand the different functionalities of this new execute command, we're going to talk about the specifiers in the specifier chain in 3 different groups. First, we're going to talk about context manipulation, so manipulating all the things I just mentioned, like the position, the dimension, the rotation, and so on. Then we're going to talk about conditionals, preventing commands from running unless certain conditions are met. And then finally we're going to talk about result management, which is how we deal with storing the result back of a command, and this turns out to be half of the new functionality that opens up enormous new possibilities. So let's get into context manipulation. Like I mentioned, there are 4 pieces of a context. It is the executing entity, position the command gets run in, the rotation it gets run in, and the dimension it gets run in. There's actually a 5th one that we'll get into last. It's a little more tricky to explain, but we'll get there. The first subcommand is execute as, and then a selector. That changes the executing entity but nothing else. That means that your command will still execute in the same dimension, position, and rotation as it was before, but it will change who executes the command. This might seem pretty pointless to you, but it does have 2 very big advantages. First, if you put in a selector that selects more than one entity, then this can cause the command to run multiple times for those entities. Second, it changes the @s selector for any subsequent specifier and the command that ends up being run. The next specifier we're going to look at is execute at and then a selector. This is a shorthand that changes the dimension and position and rotation of the command that gets run, which is very similar to, but not entirely, the old execute movement. There are also separate pieces of this. You can change the position of a command by using /execute positioned followed by X, Y, and Z positions, or positioned as followed by a selector, and either way this changes the position only, but keeps the command rotated the same way as it was and in the same dimension as it was. There's another way to change the position as well, that is line and then providing a set of axes. This changes the position to be aligned to the block grid by rounding down, but only on the specified axis. So you can specify X, Y, or Z axis and any combination of them. So you can specify, for instance, X, Z if you want. There are a number of ways to change the rotation of a command as well. You can put in rotated, then Y and X rotation values, or rotated as in the selector, change rotation to match that entity's rotation. You can also use the facing concept brought over from the Bedrock edition, where you can put in facing X, Y, and Z coordinates to change the rotation of the command to look at the certain position, or facing entity and the selector and feet or eyes to look at the feet or eyes of that entity. And one thing to note about all of these arguments for the selectors is that if you provide a selector that gives more than one result, then the command will run multiple times. You can also change which dimension a command executes in, so you can do /execute in followed by a dimension that is overworld, the nether, or the end. Finally, there's one more piece of the context that is kind of hidden for most cases, that is anchored. And you can put in anchored feet or anchored i's. And basically what this does is it changes the base of local coordinates to be feet or i's. And the point of this is to make it easier both to move in a certain direction as you are pointing, but also to look directly at a certain block or entity. And that was the last piece of context manipulation you can do in an execute command. Let's move over to conditionals. All conditionals will be execute if or execute unless, where in every case unless is the exact inverse of the if case, which means that when you have something that is execute if and then a specifier, then execute unless will execute in all of the cases that execute if would not execute. Hopefully that makes sense. There are a number of them. You can do execute if block x, y, and z and then a block specifier. And that takes over the functionality of the old /test for block and the old execute detect function. The subcommand will only run if the block at the given position matches the block specifier. And of course note that since you have block specifiers with states and with NBT, you can match any block in any detail this way. There's also a replacement for test for blocks, which is execute if blocks, or execute unless blocks of course, and that takes a beginning set and an ending set of coordinates and then a destination and an all or masked. It's exactly the same parameters as you would use for /test for blocks. And it executes the subcommand only if the blocks between begin and end match those anchored in destination with the same offsets. Of course you can test for entities as well. You can do execute if or unless entity and then a selector, and that makes the command only execute if the selector returns at least one result. You can test for scores on a scoreboard as well. There's execute if or unless score, and then a target objective, a comparison operator that is less than or equals, greater than or equals, or just greater than, and then a source and a source objective. This basically compares two different scores and executes the subcommand only if that comparison returns true. There's also another version of this, which is if score and then a target and then an objective matches and then a range, which just checks a target score in a certain objective against a preset range. For conditional subcommands, there's actually a separate way of running them as well. You can use these executes without a run specifier. And what that means is that they act as their own command and they return their number of matches. Which means that you can count the number of blocks in a region, for instance, or the number of entities, essentially working exactly as /test for or /test for blocks did in previous versions. Now there's actually a good reason to do this in this version, and that is because you can do things with the result of commands. And that is also driven by the execute command in terms of result management. There is an execute store subcommand, and this takes an argument that is result or success, which determines which of the result fields of a command gets stored. The result value of a command will be entirely dependent on what the command is, and the success value of the command always stores the amount of successful executions. So for instance, the /clear command will result in a number of matching items, but it will succeed once. Now the store functionality can also take a number of different targets, which determine where the data gets stored. And this is where it becomes really interesting. So you can do, for instance, /execute store result score, and then a name and an objective, which stores the result value to a scoreboard. Now this is what you would previously do with /stats, except that it's much easier to use and you don't need to worry about things like setting the value to 0 beforehand or anything like that. And it also only applies to this one command that you actually wanted it to apply for, so you don't have to keep running stats and then switching stats off again or some silliness like that. Of course the objective has to exist, but that is the only precondition. You can also store directly to NBT, one of the massive big features in this version that we have fought for a long time, and through long discussions with Dinnerbone, we finally came to the conclusion that this was a good way to get it in. What you do is just do execute store with the result or success, and then block X, Y, and Z and their path and a type and a scale value. Or execute store and the result or success entity, a selector, a path, a type, and a scale. Now a number of these things need an explanation. The type is an NBT numeric type specifier that is byte, double, float, int, long, or short. This is needed because when the value needs to be stored into NBT, if the field doesn't already exist, the game needs to know how to store the value. Now the path is a different thing. Path specifiers are new to this version, but they're used in a number of places. And that is essentially an address for a sub-field deep inside of an NBT structure. You can use dot to specify member access in a compound, so for instance you could use something like display dot to access the display field in an item. You can also access arrays, use square brackets for that with a number in parentheses specifying which index it is. And if there's a rare case where a member name has a space or invalid character in the name, then you can quote that name with quotation marks. Finally, the scale factor will let you take a value that you got and scale it up or down, which lets you deal with things that were initially floating point values, multiply them by a number and then put them into a scoreboard, do operations on it and then multiply it back by a scale value and put it back into a floating point value. There's one more thing you can store results into, that is store result or success boss bar, an ID, value or max, and that would store a value directly into a boss bar. We'll get into that when we talk about the new /bossbar command later, but all you need to know for now is that a boss bar can have a value and a maximum value, and you can store command results directly into either of those fields. And then finally, once you've gotten to the end of your specifier chain, you just put run and then whatever subcommand it is, and the only change to this is that you are no longer allowed to have a preceding slash. Now let's get into changes to Scoreboard. Scoreboards hold some of the key components to what increases the power of commands in this version, but they're not actually that changed. All the data tag arguments have been removed because, of course, data tags are now a part of selectors themselves. The Scoreboard player's test command has been removed as well because you can now do that with /execute if score. And there is a new subcommand. It's /scoreboard players get, and then you give it a target, which is a name or a selector, and an objective. And what that does is it returns the score of that target in that objective as the result of the command, which means that you can do whatever you like with it using the new execute functionality, like store it into a boss bar or into an NBT field. Objective names have changed. The display names of objectives is what I'm talking about, not their IDs. The objective display names are now text components instead of raw strings, which means that you can have any number of formatting in there, or you can even have selectors in there or change their text dynamically that way. You can also use a new command called /scoreboard objectives modify and then the objective name and render type to switch between the integer and hearts rendering. That is no longer tied to the type of the objective, but you can get any objective type to render as hearts. The tag and team subcommands of Scoreboard have also been split into their own command, so instead of doing /scoreboard players tag, you now just do /tag, and instead of doing /scoreboard team, you now do /team. Teams have also changed further. The team option subcommand is now called team modify, and the friendly fire option is now friendly and then capital F fire for consistency with the other options. And the prefix and suffix fields are now proper text components as well, so you can put in colors and formatting into team prefixes and suffixes. There are a bunch of changes to teleportation as well that tie in a little bit with what we talked about with the context and execution before. The /TP and teleport commands are now aliases. That means there's no special functionality for teleporting with /TP relative to a previous entry in the command anymore, no special case anymore. It's just a teleport that works consistently across the board. Very happy about this. There are a number of forms, and some of them that are used for simplicity have been simplified so they no longer support all the fancy arguments. So you can still do /teleport or /TP to just an entity that will teleport yourself to that entity, but it doesn't allow rotation or facing arguments. It will teleport you directly to that entity and it will rotate you the same way as that entity is rotated. You could also do teleport X, Y, and Z values, and it will just teleport you directly to those X, Y, and Z values, and it doesn't allow rotation or facing at all. The more advanced forms take a victim parameter, so if you want to do more advanced forms but still teleport yourself, just do /teleport and then @s to teleport yourself. And then you can put in an entity, which doesn't allow rotation or facing again because it teleports the victim to that entity and copies the rotation as well. You can also do /teleport with a victim selector and then X, Y, and Z, and then optionally a Y rotation and an X rotation, and that will teleport the victim to that position with that rotation. And if either Y rotation or X rotations are not specified, then they will be whatever the rotation of the context is. There's also a new facing functionality brought over from the Bedrock edition. You can do /teleport with the victim X, Y, and Z facing another X, Y, and Z, and that will teleport the victim to the first X, Y, and Z and rotate it to look at that second position. Or you can do teleport the victim selector X, Y, and Z facing entity and then another entity selector and optionally feet or eyes. And that will teleport the victim selector targets to the position specified and then looking at the entity's feet or eyes, and the default for that is feet. One more change to teleport is that teleporting to an entity in a different dimension than the one you're in right now is allowed, and even teleporting to another dimension by just using /execute to switch which dimension the command runs in is also allowed. So you can actually do /execute in the nether, run and then a teleport to certain coordinates, and that will teleport you to that position in the nether rather than in the overworld or wherever you are right now. /XP command has changed. It is now /experience, and XP is just an alias, and it's been changed to remove the dependence on this L postfix weird notation. The new syntax is /experience add and a selector followed by an amount and then either points or levels. The default for this is points, and negative numbers are supported, which removes points. If you specify points, it will add that number of points, which of course can make you level up. And then if you put a negative number in, then that can actually remove points and make you level down. If you put in levels instead, it will add a certain number of levels, and the percentage of the current level completed will remain the same. There's also a /experience set and a selector and an amount and then points or levels, which if you specify points will set the number of points within the current level, and if you specify levels will specify the number of levels but leave the percentage unchanged. There's also /experience query and a selector and points or levels, which lets you get as a result value the exact number of levels the player has or the number of points within the level the player has. Now let's get into the entirely new commands in this version. One of the absolutely most important one is /data. It comes out of /entity data and /block data, and it replaces those, but it does so much more as well. The first form we're going to talk about is /data merge, and what that does is exactly what /entity data and /block data used to do. So you put data merge block and then position and an NBT specifier, or data merge entity and a selector and an NBT specifier, and it will change the block or entity NBT to merge in that new data. But there's more. You can also do /data get with block and a position and a path and a scale, or /data get entity with a selector and a path and a scale. So here again, the path and the scale come in as we saw in /execute before, and this lets you get a value from the NBT of a block or an entity, scale it up or down, and then return it as the result value of a command, which means that you can store something from an NBT value directly into a scoreboard or into a boss bar or wherever you like, or even copy it into a different NBT field or at a different entity. Very powerful. The path here is optional, as is the scale, and if you don't give them, then your result value might not be very interesting, but the matching NBT fields will be printed to the output if you use it from the command line in-game, which means that it's a very convenient way to inspect the NBT of an entity or block live. And note that this also does work on players. Even if you still cannot change the NBT of a player in this version, you can actually read the NBT of a player properly. The final form of the /data command is /data remove block with a position and a path, or /data remove entity with a selector and a path, and they do what should be obvious: they remove that field from that piece of NBT. The second new command that we're going to look at is /bossbar. It is used to create and manage custom boss bars, just like you see when you fight the Ender Dragon or the Wither. The basic form of this is /bossbar create with an ID and a name to create a new boss bar. The ID is a normal text identifier that you'll use to refer to the boss bar, similar to how an objective ID works, and the name, just like objectives in this version, is a JSON text component. So you can create a boss bar with fancy coloring, formatting, or even selector names and other dynamic information in the name. You can also change things with the boss bar by using the /bossbar set command that takes an ID, an option, name, and a value. The available options are name, which just sets the name JSON text component, color, which sets the color of the boss bar, and the default for that is white, style, which changes the style and the visual appearance of the boss bar. There are 5 options for it. They are progress, notched _6, notched _10, notched _12, and notched _20. The default for this is progress. You can also set the value of the boss bar, that is the current value of the boss bar, and the default for this is 0. And you can set the max value of the boss bar, and the default for that is 100. Finally, boss bars are not necessarily visible to all players. You can control the visible status by setting the visible option to true or false, and the default is true, and the players option, which defaults to an empty set of players. The players option controls to which players the boss bar is visible. Of course, you can manage which boss bars exist as well. You can get a list of them with /bossbarList. You can remove one with /bossbarRemove and then the ID. And there's also a /bossbarGet with an ID and then max or players or value or visible to get one of those options as the command results. Another new command is /datapack. It, like the name implies, controls datapacks in the game. You can use /datapack enable or disable with the name of a datapack to enable or disable it. And for /datapack enable, you can also control the order in which the datapacks end up. And you do this by specifying a second argument. That argument is first, last, before and another datapack, or after and another datapack. And you can also do /datapack list, and that also takes an optional parameter which can be set to available or enabled. There are more changes to commands too, mostly to support the new syntax of blocks, items and selectors, but also other things. /particle has changed. The parameters field no longer exists, and instead if you specify a particle type that needs parameters, then that parameter is specified directly after that. So for instance, the block breaking particles take the block type directly after. Another change is that the delta, the speed and the count parameters now default to 0, so you don't have to specify them. A number of commands have changed syntax only to remove fields that are no longer needed because the item and block specifiers now include them by default. These are /clear, /clone, /fill, /setBlock, /give and /replace item. You can see the differences in syntax on screen right now. I'm not going to go through them in voice in this. The /replace item command has one more syntax update, and that is that the slot dot prefix is no longer needed when specifying slots. /effect has been changed. It now has 2 specified modes. One is /effect give and the other is /effect clear. And you specify what you want to give or what you want to clear. Another change to that command is that it now fails if you try to give an effect and it does nothing. That means that if your target was immune or already had a stronger effect active, then the command will fail and return 0 success count. A bunch of commands have become a little more strict when it comes to their input enumerations. That is /default game mode and /game mode will now only accept the full game mode identifiers, so you can't specify 2 or S anymore. You have to actually specify survival or spectator or creative. In the same way, /difficulty now only accepts difficulty identifiers, not numbers, and /difficulty can now be used without arguments to return the current difficulty. /game rule no longer accepts invalid game rules. That means you can't use this to make custom game rules anymore. One change to /stop sound now accepts an asterisk for any channel. And a bunch of changes to /locate. It will now accept names for structures that were previously all called temple, that include desert_pyramid, igloo, jungle_pyramid, and swamp_hut. Of course, there are new structures in the update aquatic as well. They are buried_treasure, ocean_ruin, and shipwreck. Running the /locate command now also gives a clickable link, and if you click that you get a teleport command to the structure into your chat box, and the Y coordinate is now reported as tilde rather than question mark, which means you can teleport to the structure at the height you're currently at. It also returns a result. The result is the distance to the structure. The target of the /kill command is now mandatory, so if you want the same result as you got with just /kill before, you now have to input /kill at s. The /list command can now be used in single player. /op for operator now accepts selectors as well as specified names. And the /trigger command with only an objective name is now an accepted shorthand for /trigger with the same objective name, add 1. The two new named time specifiers that I added to Bedrock Edition have been brought over. They are noon and midnight, so you can now do /time set midnight. And the default timeout for the /weather command has changed. It used to be a small but random time and is now 5 minutes specified instead. /seed command now also has a clickable link to get the seed into the chat bar, and that means that you can then copy it. I've mentioned some of these, but let's go through them quickly. There are a number of commands that have outright been removed in this version. They are /blockdata, /entityData, /stats, /test4, /test4block, /test4blocks, and /toggleDownfall. And the last one there is the only one I haven't mentioned before, and you are now just meant to use /weather instead, which should really not be a problem for anyone. There are some new changes to the F3 screen, the debug screen, and specifically the debug keys that you should know about that relate to commands for this version. The F3+C command has been added that copies a teleport command, which teleports you to the current dimension, location, and rotation, which immediately gives you a way to get back to exactly where you were. And the F3 and I command has been added to copy, entity, or block NBT data depending on what you're looking at. If you use Shift and F3 and I, then you get the client-side only data, otherwise you get the server-side data, which is normally what you want. And you get that as a /setBlock command or as a /summon command, depending on if you were looking at a block or an entity. Also, to note, there is tick rate information inside of the F3 screen now, so you can keep an eye on that to make sure that your commands don't lag the server too much. Finally, a bunch of NBT format changes that you should know of. The ench tag for enchantments is now called enchantments with a capital E. Numeric IDs have been removed from this as well, so you no longer specify numeric IDs for enchantments. References to GUIDs of things have also changed. Thrower and owner keys of item entities are no longer strings, they are now compounds with an L and M long field, and the same goes for the owner NBT key of snowballs, eggs, and ender pearls. Also, custom name fields are now JSON text components encoded as strings instead of plain strings, so you can put formatting into these fields just like you would with, for instance, a sign line. And there we are, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the long list of command changes for Minecraft 1.13. I did mention it was a huge one, and I'm sure we've just scratched the surface this far on what's possible to do with these new capabilities. Blimey, that's a lot of things, and with that, it is time for me to say goodbye for this video. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of this. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please help me out in return and leave a like. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to my channel where you can find Minecraft news and new and interesting things for commands and map making, including tutorials. Again, thank you for watching. This has been slicedlime. See you next time. Take care. Bye bye.